Welcome to the Data Coffee Break podcast. I'm Marc.
And I'm Christian.
If you are passionate about data like us, take a seat, relax, and join us to our coffee break where we discuss all things data.
And remember, there are no filters, no PR.
It's just a real life experience. So let's begin. But the problem is we are Friday and we're all drinking water. The phone after we're recording on the Friday.
I can run down and get a beer if you want, but yeah.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, because the weather in London is fantastic, finally.
Yeah, that's true, right? I mean, like in London, I heard this thing that it's impossible not to make it about the weather. The first conversation, right? Because it's either like too extreme, so it's always like cold, not. So when you see the sun, it's always a topic of conversation. But let's get started because today we have a professional with us with more than 20 years of experience. He has worked for companies such as Adobe, Tableau, Salesforce, and he started his career actually as a predictive analytics consultant all the way to become a pre-sales solutions architect, consulting team lead, as well as sales enablement lead. He also has a degree from the University College London on computer science and a master's in cognitive science from the University of Birmingham. A friend, a great colleague, a Wolverhampton fan. We have David Sigerson, or Siggy. Welcome.
Welcome, Siggy.
Hi, guys. Great to be here.
My first question for you is, are you a doctor? I feel like in the background, I can see some lab coats.
I'm a Tableau doctor, not a proper doctor. Yeah, those are actually it's a dressing gown and a prop that I use for doing the presentation at Tableau conference. So when I did the statistics bit, it's a physical proper pull out to go, now I'm the statistician talking about stats.
And well, you have the educational experience, so you can definitely speak about that.
I certainly could try. Interestingly enough, my background is more AI and machine learning than stats, or at least it started that way. And then throughout my career, it's got more statsy. So I got more into stats the longer my career went.
Take us through that process, because, I can consider myself a person that ended up doing what I'm doing, more of a consequential thing rather than actually thinking about it. As you mentioned, right, your background is machine learning more than the statistics, but you also went into marketing analytics. So how that actually works? That will be really useful for the audience out there that is actually either starting or planning to move into different fields.
Yeah, it's an evolution, really. I love the idea of AI and I love the investigating the mind and all that kind of stuff. And then I need to get a job. And I found myself doing some quite cool things in the field of data mining, as well as being very keen on AI and that kind of thing. I was also very keen on the internet because the internet was in its early days. It wasn't the beginning, but it was certainly early on before things went a bit crazy. And I was just trying to do anything that was AI and internet related. So that was where I focused for the first few years of my career. And then as soon as the dot-com crash happened, it meant that actually there was not much scope for AI and internet, or at least not lots of jobs and lots of opportunities. So I then moved into applying the AI perhaps across more domains. So it was wherever it was useful. So it could be marketing, as you mentioned. It could be fraud. It could be credit and risk. It could be did it with policing, did it with pharmaceuticals, all sorts of weird stuff, because you were generally applying what you knew about machine learning to domains that other people introduced you to as part of being a consultant. And one of the things about the marketing part of the world was just that, and people may or may not realize this, marketing had a very deep roots in terms of analytics. So they, despite being marketing, sounding perhaps a little fluffy, there's quite a long history of control tests, control groups, trying to build churn models, retention rates, all these kind of things that relate to the complex relationship that you have with a customer, and trying to use some analytics around that. So I don't think that was what got me into marketing, but it then moved that way. I still loved the internet, still loved AI, and so I just moved with the times. And that got me ultimately to Adobe, which was a company very much focused on online marketing, and they had some cool technologies to go with it.
We're talking about that was 20 years ago. It seems that the challenges are very similar to today, right? So I mean, I don't know. That's kind of my point of view.
Actually, on that point, like the challenges at the time you said, like you started with AI, my understanding, like obviously the last 10 years, we have a huge rise in terms of cloud computing. And the days where companies were able to have enough power in-house to do some AI and machine learning was extremely limited because it was super costly. So I don't know what was your perspective in terms of like in organization that was extremely targeted use cases? Was it outsourced for some organizations?
Yeah, it's a different world, but basically back in, say, the early 2000s, I was working with a tool that you could install you had to have a pretty powerful machine, but you could install it on a machine. It had to be powerful because it was usually a Windows machine that was running a Unix emulator at the time. So there was a certain amount of power wrapped up in that as well.
Yeah.
But we were working with decision trees. We were working with neural networks. We weren't the only ones. There was software out there where you could build your own neural network. You could work with all sorts of volumes of data. Even in those early days, we were working on terabytes, or I don't remember coming up against much bigger than terabytes, but multiple terabytes of data that would be modeled on. But you went in with it with, you weren't stupid about what you were doing. So what I mean by that is you didn't go with this sort of carte blanche idea that you're just going to model every piece of data that you're going to see. Spend a lot more time going, well, what's the thing that you're trying to solve? What's the data that's relevant to the problem that I'm doing? And then you'd build a model that works for you. Now, you might then deploy it across a terabyte of data, and there'd be a scoring implication there. But actually, that was not, you didn't go and just say, let's build a model on every piece of data that we've got, which is much more of the freedom that you have today. But at the same time, what it means is you have a certain mentality of just give me loads of data and I'll build a model. But that's not how we did it. And it's actually, there's the reason we were successful was because we didn't do that.
Yeah.
We didn't go in and just say, let's build a model. We said, what is the problem we're trying to solve and how best can we solve it? It's a different approach to the way that I was coming out of university, and it's a different approach to the way that I see people now, which is initially you think I've got a brilliant technology which will solve everything, so I'll just put it on top of my data and it will solve it. And then you realize after 2 days of training, whatever it is that you thought you're training, it doesn't work that way. The thing you were looking for, you've built something that's useless, so you have to go back and build it again. And slowly you realize actually it's a lot better if I think about it in advance, what it is that I need to do, and also be a bit more specific in how you go about building these things.
That's actually quite an interesting one because like a recurring theme that I'm listening now is that we're trying to solve the business problem. If you want to be successful when we talk to the models rather than, for example, technology and so on. To me, these models, machine learning models or statistical models, I mean, I always get a bit into how do they not necessarily how they actually work, but, is there a difference between, this is statistics, this is science, if you know what I mean? Because sometimes they are put together, especially on this type of use cases.
We put everything in the same bucket at the moment. It's difficult to distinguish what is stats and what is actual machine learning, yeah.
There is a common argument that they're two different schools of thought. And when I started, I actually started as a data miner, like a data scientist, as it were, in a statistics company. So there was almost immediately this conflict between the two different ways of doing things. And that was 20 years ago. And yet today, same thing is still going on, which is statisticians kind of think that you need to know how the world looks, like that you have an understanding of the distribution of your data, that you have a hypothesis, you have a view of the world, so that when you look at the data, you can say whether that data fits with your view of the world. So you have a sort of a pre-existing model that you then test against. Whereas the sort of data science people go, I don't really care about the world, just feed me data. As you feed me data, I'll learn more about it and, I'll work it out. Now, they both have strengths and weaknesses. I think coming from the data science sort of side of things, it's a good approach, but it kind of assumes that you'll eventually have all the data in the world. And if you don't, you've got to realize that, because if you if you don't realize you've only got a partial view of the world or a partial view of the problem that you're facing, your models, your machines, your approach will fail because it fails to take into account the broader human existence. I know it's a bit big, but it just goes, oh, feed me data and I'll work it out, instead of going, well, actually that data is part of the bigger system. Whereas the statistician would probably be a bit more applied about it and go, well, I've got data about this problem in this area. What is the distribution that I would expect? Let's test for that. Once I've tested for it, let's see if I've got things that are with that or not.
Just like that, as you put at the beginning, it's like a conflict between those two. But I always thought personally that you needed statistics first before going to the second phase of more data science and modeling. That was my conception of the world, but apparently people will go directly on the second step without having some kind of level of descriptive analytics of their data.
Look, I'll hold my hands up. When I started, I was very much non-statistical. And actually, when you apply a model to a data set, as long as you've asked as long as you know what you're trying to achieve, you can often get some good insights just by applying a model straightforward. There you go. You get some results and you can play with it. Usually you build 2, 3, 4, maybe 100 models at a go, just to see, understand the data better before you build the model. But it kind of sidesteps this idea that actually what you're doing is you're just trying to get to a better understanding of the underlying data before you build the model to begin with. Now, well, as a quick aside, but obviously this is talking about like a commercial business situation where you're trying to say, I have a problem to solve. But if you're building a model for, I don't know, image detection or something like that, it's not so much that there's a business problem to solve then. Then it becomes much more about, right, have I got the right data representing all the images that I want? And now I don't know whether people go to great depths of statistics in those kind of situations, because it's much more about, right, I've got models, I've got images. Does the model score the images appropriately? But put it another way, when you do that and go, oh, well, it's just images and it's just a model and nothing matters, you can very quickly get into those areas of bias, because you get into that situation where you've built a model on some images, but you haven't acknowledged that those images themselves are different forms of distribution within them that are at a sort of meta level. So it's not about what the images, how well they're classified, but they could be what those images mean in society, and therefore how that thing will be applied when you deploy the model.
I remember 2 or 3 years ago, you could hear that, a good 3 years ago, it was everywhere on the news, on podcasts, where you were always hearing ethics around AI and the problem of model being biased, gender biased, or biased in all sorts of ways. There is difficulties to put in place tools to control that, obviously. As you say, Siggy, is like the basic point is, what data do you feed in to build this model to make sure like you actually have a balanced like a data set here to that extent?
Well, let's throw in the problem. Let's assume that you have bias in the model because the world is biased. Maybe that you have a data set that fundamentally has let's say a gender split that is not appropriate. So you say, right, I need to adjust this data to account not for what's in the data, but for what I think the data ought to be.
Yeah.
So then you're at bias straight away, right? Because you will be removing records or amending records in some kind of way to say, right, it was a 60-40 split, but I've somehow got to magic into this 51-49 split or whatever it might be. So you introduce bias straight away. But the first model was a reflection of the world, but it was a world that you didn't want reflected. So you choose what to do about it. And these are the things that aren't necessarily explicit when people are talking about solving bias in AI. They're not talking about, well, it's bad because usually it's because the data is bad, but sometimes it's bad because the world is bad. The world doesn't reflect what we want the world to reflect, right? And so you've got to say, right, well, we need to fix it. But as soon as you fix it, how do you justify the fix that you apply? Now, in the old days, that was part of what we did, in the sense of it was less science and more art, but you would essentially be pulling out the bits of the data that you thought, well, that's inappropriate or that's not quite right, and you'd be amending the sort of the proportions of data in your samples before you built your models. So you'd be applying some kind of rationalization to it. But I introduced bias all the time. Bias was actually very good. To get a good model, you would generally have to shuffle the data around. You'd have to omit records, the bad records that are bad data. You'd have to omit the records that are extremities or outliers that don't make any sense. And then you would start playing around trying to, get the model that you want. Very difficult without introducing your own bias, but also biasing the data that's in the system.
This is a really good explanation of how you create bias on your models, right?
I'm just thinking like kind of at scale in production, it becomes like a political / potentially philosophical question, as you say, like, okay, gender split like 49.5-50. This is because of the reality, or this is because what we want it to be, and we can imagine that for every variable in terms of this model. So very delicate positioning here, I guess, for the data scientist.
I would like to take it back to where we're talking about. You were creating these models, and you are actually very good at even identifying the differences between those, right? Scientists and statistics. And I always hear that we would like to know what we have with our data. And let me just give you a bit of background there. With the explosion of computing, cloud computing that Marc just mentioned, people and like practitioners, everyone say like, just dump all of your data. The storage is cheap. Let's just do that, right?
And we figure out after.
And then we figure out after. And then people are start to realize that actually, you know what? I don't know what's on my what's on my data warehouse. I guess that's when we decided to become data driven. And let's say, oh yes, we need to be data driven. And in order to be data driven, we are going to create another model to explain the model. You have been through like a different, let's say, stages, right? In waves. You have seen them like firsthand. Can you tell us, like, on your point of view, how we get here?
So there's probably a couple of different ways you can take this. I mean, there's never been a time when people haven't been selling database software, right? Since the 1960s, 70s, or whatever it is. So there's always been, we will build it and we will store it, and you will use it. That sort of paradigm exists, and it is as true today, but perhaps importantly, as true yesterday as it was today. So the message hasn't changed. We will store more data. The question of what do we do with it once it's stored, or we've waited 3 years for this system to be built. Can we now use it? We're probably better at using the data now than we ever were, because we're more sophisticated. We've got more things integrated. We've got more uses for the data, for sure. But there's a difference between, say, data that's, say, collected for a particular application, a particular domain, and you're collecting it, and actually the users may or may not know exactly what's going on with the data, but they know how they want to apply it, whether it be in marketing, whether it be in HR for recruiting purposes. Like, they kind of just, they know what they need to do, and then they go forward with it. But you still have a lot of situations where people will say, I've got data. What is it? What should we do with the data that we have? And that's usually a reflection of people just collecting data for the sake of it. There's a lot of that goes on, right? It's a mistake to think about getting the data and storing it, getting the data and doing something, like exploring and doing something with it. Because I'm much more of the belief that if you wanted a company to become more data-driven, which is, as you know, a phrase that I'm not that keen on, data literate or whatever it might be, which is a slightly different tangent, you've got to start with the questions. What are the problems that you're trying to solve? And then you go to the data. And one of the things that I think we didn't do very well 20 years ago, and we don't do very well now, is we don't teach people or help people ask good questions. If I was going to try and make a company, customer, individual better, both in terms of data literacy and being more driven by data, I'd almost want to teach them how to ask questions better.
That's interesting. Yeah. We obviously have at the moment the big trend, which is like generative AI. I see a lot of posts on LinkedIn about people don't know to use generative AI because there is a new word upcoming, maybe role upcoming, which is prompt engineering. So it's all about like asking the right question. So coming back to what you said, like we go too fast, basically using whatever model we have here, like generative AI, but we don't think carefully how to craft our question and how to approach it. Yeah.
And the question you craft is going to be quite different depending on, I would say, how dynamic the environment is. So if you've got, say, a chat bot, or you've got a scenario where you've got a call center that's dealing with one or two products that is, you get the same questions every week, that bot doesn't have to be very dynamic. The questions that it might generate don't have to be very varied. Doesn't really have to have much context around those two or three products or where the customer might be. But you think about the same bot, I don't know, the CEO bot, the bot that controls the company. What are the questions they can ask? It's a different set of questions, but it's also a much more dynamic environment. You've got stock price, you've got people, you've got, profit, you've got loss, you've got all these different things that are changing constantly. So the kind of questions you'd be asking, that explodes how many questions there might be. So actually, it is about asking the right question, but it's actually being aware of how dynamic the environment is that the question and the answer is being built. You got a simple, you look at the AI that did like the chess or that solved the Go programs. When I was at university, that was like my holy grail. Can we think about, or can we build pieces of software that would do that? But actually, on reflection, one of the key things is that's a very specific domain. Yes, there's lots of moves, there's lots of things, but actually, its randomness is quite controlled, so it's not chaotic. But if it's in a situation where it's very dynamic, lots of randomness from lots of different areas, then you have situations where it's actually asking the right question becomes hard, right? Because, I'm the CEO of the company and I say, right, what's the right question? I want to increase sales, or I want to increase my share price. But you don't just do that. You come up with a strategy that says, well, I want to increase my share price, but in order to do that, I'm going to increase sales. But in order to do that, I'm going to increase my position in the marketplace so that people think the product that I built is worth buying. Or I'm going to have a great retention policy that means people know they'll always get looked after when they buy my product. And it spills out. You get this very big set of questions, and that's where it moves from being able to ask the right question and being able to look at the environment you're in and being able to sort of focus on something that's important to you and driving in a good direction. I'm getting a bit wishy-washy and away from models. But actually, this is why when I did move away from models, it was one of those things that was really bugging me, because you could build the best models, you could answer the question, but if you weren't really thinking about the context of how the model was going to be deployed or how the solution was going to be implemented, and then start thinking about the strategy, in my case, it was often the marketing strategy that was being deployed, you were kind of wasting your time either by building a model that doesn't get used or a model that worked against what it was that you were the company was trying to achieve in the first place.
I do believe that right now, with how available is technology for everybody, and I'm talking about here is like how easy, and I'm air quoting easy, is to get started first. People now have this expectation to let the machine tell me what I'm supposed to be asking and tell me what to do next, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. And that's a bit of laziness on like our part, right? Or those individual part. I mean, I think we all do it, right? We all want the easy life where we get the answers. And perhaps it's because people don't really perhaps know what they're doing a lot of the time, and they just want to be fed something that solves the problem. But often they're not, and particularly when they're buying software that does whatever magic it's supposed to do, they're not actually asking what is the problem that it's solving. Like, how is it impacting the thing that I do, because they don't necessarily identify clearly what it is that they're trying to achieve. Well, I used to work on software that would do targeting online, but we during the dot-com crash, right, the only people who were really buying this kind of fancy targeted software were the banks. The banks had lots of money. They were still like buying these kind of models that would target people because they kind of knew what modeling was and whatever. People would buy the modeling software and they wouldn't really know what it was doing. They wouldn't really care what it was doing. They would just be happy that it solves the problem of putting the imagery out there that sells whatever product they think that the model thinks it should sell. They weren't then going, well, what does that impact on my business, or what is it doing and why is it doing it? And how do we get that to work with our campaign strategy, which might be at odds with what the modeling is doing for today? So a good example would be, you hit April in the UK, we have something called an ISA, which is like a tax-free savings vehicle. It's the time when you open one or close one generally. So you kind of want everybody to be marketed with that particular product. But if the model is built that basically said most people should really get a loan because it's the most profitable thing for your organization, that model is in contradiction to whatever your marketing strategy actually is at that given time. But if you don't know what the model's doing, and actually you're not very explicit about what your strategy is, you get into all sorts of mess where you've got mixed messages and inconsistent communications with the customer.
I'm curious to know, if you can share one or two stories, what things like people did with models, because pretty much, as you said, is going to be like the person didn't really ask the right question and boom, I did a model. Yes, it's working, but didn't really realize the the output and the impact of it. I'm really curious if you remember one or two.
Okay, I'll run off a few different ones. Some that I was involved with, some that come second hand from other people. And these are real stories, so it's not like those kind of made up ones or whatever that. You hear there's always like the same story, like the father who discovered the daughter was pregnant because they were targeted for birth control via.
Oh yeah,
yeah, classic story, right? Everybody kind of knows it. But I think that one was made up. But he was just trying to make the point that there's sort of correlations out there that you might not expect. But I mean, I saw ones where I remember hearing a story where essentially a large retailer placed a supermarket in the wrong place because they just did not understand what correlation was. So they looked at where they thought they would be getting the most people, the biggest sort of set of people they could market to. They saw a chart, and because they misunderstood what correlation and what the p-value and the r-squared and everything else, because they misunderstood what that was, they just went, oh, look, see, this shows we'll do really well if we put this building here. And they went and put that building there.
Massive misinvestment, clearly.
I mean, that's one. I mean, another one was, we touched on it earlier with the loans and the banking. So you had this situation where you have, like, main products are like current accounts, credit cards, savings, loans, mortgages, that kind of thing. And initially they built models. So rather than actually coming up with their own way of doing marketing those different products, they said, we'll build a model. So what happened? They didn't realize, but day one, what happens is you build a model and the model learns, guess what? If they've come onto your website and they've searched for Barclays loans, guess what? They're interested in loans. Or if they've searched for current accounts, they'll look for current accounts. So you had this model building stuff that was like common sense, right? You didn't need to do something that was sophisticated to actually get a solution to that problem. But then, they don't really look into that. So that's number one. You don't always need a model. You just need sometimes to think about what your problem is. But then number two, they go, oh, well, that's just for click through. That's just people coming on our website and when they're clicking on an advert once they're on our site to that product. What we really want to get to is not just that they take up the product, but we want to understand the value of that product in the organization. Well, guess what? If somebody takes up a credit account, doesn't earn much for the company. It's good. You get some personal information, but actually it's usually kind of a lost leader to the other products that you then push to them. So, but they're like, oh yeah, so we want to make sure that we're maximizing it so that we're making sure that people are targeted with something that is most beneficial for this organization. Well, guess what? They made most of their money on loans. So what happened was whenever you came onto the website, it didn't matter what product you said, oh, I'm interested in opening a current account, you'd get a loans advert because you just need one person in 1,000 to take that loan, like click through and then apply for a loan. And, you've made your money. You've justified why the model does what it does, which is sell everybody a loan. But actually, if you know everybody's going to be like sold a loan, you don't need a model. You just have a rule that says everybody sell everybody a loan.
Yeah, definitely.
That's an if else. You did an if else condition. That's it.
Yeah, exactly. So and that happened a lot where people were looking for models to be applied where actually it was either common sense or things that they should make their own decisions. So this one isn't real, but you're selling Ferraris, or at least you're selling cars. You go, well, everybody wants a Ferrari. Well, of course they do, but can they afford it? Does it make sense for them? Is it the right thing to do in that situation?
Yeah, I think that's extremely valuable, what you are referring there to, right? So for everyone to always, I would say, start backwards, right? Start from what is it that you're trying to achieve rather than just go and jump on the model creation or on the specific technology on it.
I mean, we're making a big play at helping customers become data driven. That's the phrase they use. So I'm going to ask you, because you said ask you questions. What do you think? What would it take for a company to be data driven, or what do you think that means?
You want to start?
Let me just ask ChatGPT right now.
Yeah.
So part or whatever. So in reality, to be honest with you, the data driven, it's a combination of change of culture, paradigm shift in culture. One thing that I see. And when I talk about culture, I'm not talking about you give everyone access to data on a free way, but it's really how your patterns to get your data and consume it changes based on that specific business use case. Because most of the time we are very fixated into solving one technology issue, like is my dashboard too slow, or is my I don't have access to this data. Okay, so there it is. But we don't start with, and that's why I'm talking about culture here, right? We don't start with that. What is it, the business problem we're trying to achieve? I don't know, Mark, what do you think?
For me, it's a big part of education and helping to responsibilize users, employees, collaborators in an organization where they're not going to take things for granted, and they will like basically ask. Well, we're back to asking the right question. My God, yes, definitely. But yeah, ask the right question. But that obviously implies providing the right tools or access to the right tools and technologies. I mean, it's well known how many people are making their own decision because they try to ask access to a specific tools that could help them to be a bit more data driven, but they don't have this access. So that's sometimes like a simple problem to solve, I would say.
What is in your opinion then, to you?
So I think it's much more about just change. The business owner wants to know that you as an organization will change positively. And they want to justify it by saying, you'll do it in some way that makes sense. But it's really just saying we want the organization, each individual, to be able to make a change in their everyday business for the better, right? But that doesn't reference data, doesn't help the selling of data products. But it really is all about, if I'm going to make a change in my business, if I'm going to change the process, if I'm going to hire different people, if I'm going to fire people, if I'm going to move into new worlds, if I'm going to create a new product, it's if I do that, can I do it in a way that I think I can justify, that will be effective to me? And so I think data-driven as a concept doesn't really work because it's not the driven that's the problem. It's the people are going to make these changes regardless of whether they're using data or not. But what they're trying to say is let's try and make the changes with our best guesses, right? And let's try and at the very least justify them.
Yeah.
But you know how it goes. It doesn't matter where you are in the organization. There's always a bit of politics. There's always a bit of spin of the data. There's always a bit of bias of the data. So like this data-driven concept comes into, well, who can play with the data the best to back up the thing that I'm, that they're talking about at any given time.
Exactly, yeah.
The changes will always happen in the organization. The question is, can you do anything to make some of those changes better? And it isn't even about justifying it, because as I say, lots of times it's people will go, well, my data shows me this. But then the question is, well, that's for today. But in tomorrow's world, when the market has changed or the environment's different, the data might say something different. So have you thought about that in your strategy? And most of the time it's no. I just showed you what happened last week and, I wanted to make the change I wanted to make. So that suits me. So when it comes to being data-driven, you slowly move along this path, which is forget the data, think about the change. If you're going to make the change, how do you justify or how do you disprove that change will not work?
I guess to me, the follow-up on that is then data literacy. Do you see that as part of the change or as a consequence of the change?
Okay, guys, what do you think data literacy is?
Okay, so I was first, Mark. It's your turn to start.
What comes to my mind now, but it might not completely fit the definition here, but we have difficulties to use simply the tools that aim to analyze their data. That could be Excel is the most widely used tool when it comes to, let's say, data analysis in organization and in personal life. And there is still so many people who don't know how to use them, and they could benefit so much from it. So for me here, data literacy is like being able to understand those tools, being able to understand we are speaking about like descriptive statistical analytics. So being able to understand like terms such as average, mean, and such as like trend lines, etc. So that's my point of view. That might be a bit naive, I would say, but that's what come up right now to my mind.
Just not to repeat some of it. I mean, to me as well is to understand the context of the data, right? So, for example, we're talking about marketing, right? If I go and see a table in my database that has the information needed to calculate customer lifetime value, I might not even know where to start. I don't know if do I need to get the visits versus the clicks versus impressions versus this, and I can say that I'm not literate enough, to actually understand this data, right? So therefore, if I work in the marketing department or marketing analytics, I need to become better at my data literacy for understanding this type of data. But that's kind of my opinion on that one. And Sigi, what is it? What is data literacy? Tell us.
It's marketing nonsense, isn't it? It's like neither of your descriptions really has got to like data from the concept of megabytes, kilobytes, packets of data, storage, SQL. Like it hasn't touched any of that, right? If you have something called data literacy, and you think about like the literal translation of those words, it would be, do you know how to build a database or something like that, right? But both of you answered it in terms of, well, can you look at something and immediately understand it? Or I would say at the very least, we should be moving to can you look at something and look at it and go, yeah, that doesn't look right. But the only way you can say, oh, that doesn't look right is by having an understanding of the distribution of the data. But I'm going to take away the word data, the distribution of the problem. So it's like, are you talking about people? Are you talking about products? Are you talking about sales in the real world? Are you talking about the communications from satellites going around the globe? It's not the data, which is just it's a representation of the problem. What we're really saying is we want to be able to solve the problems in our domains better. And actually by calling it data literacy, we're falling down that trap again, which is, we'll just build a database. We'll just get people more familiar with flat files. We'll get more people. We'll get people more familiar with what an average is, or whatever. And actually, yeah, I agree with you, Mark. It's good if they get that kind of statistical grounding or knowledge of the data, but it's really much more about, well, what is the thing that you're trying to do something with? The point I'm making is, I think it's really badly named, right? Data literacy. It's not numeric literacy. It's not graph literacy. It's not technology literacy. It's what people are really saying is, are you asking the right questions when you are faced with a challenge in business? So when you are faced with a graph, when you're faced with we just improved our sales by 20%. The reality is somebody sitting there going, hang on a minute, 20% doesn't sound right. We haven't done that well in our region. We've only increased by 5%, and we represent the biggest region in the business. So how did they get 20%? Where did that come from? So for me, the concept of data literacy is, can you ask those questions? Are you looking at it and going, does the thing I see make sense? And in order for it to make sense, you have to have a lot of context around what it is you're assessing. And you've got to want to ask those questions. And that, I think, is tying back to everything else. It's how do you benefit yourself or a company? How do you make them change? But how do you do it in a way that will be for the better? And how are you going to do it? How are you going to challenge the status quo in a way that will either at least question what there is? You don't always have to prove everything. Some things aren't provable. But how can you say, well, have you ever thought about this?
Thank you, Ziggy. This is actually quite useful. And I think you gave a lot of good pointers for everyone out there that would like to get advice on how to become data driven, how to tackle specific problems and where to start and ask the right question, right? We have one question that we ask every guest in the show, right? And that is, what is the single most important professional advice you ever received?
Look, I get lots of advice. Some of them saucier than others, but I would say that there's one thing that was presented to me probably at two different times in my career, and I'm going to try and paraphrase it. Basically, it's around the mantra of know thyself. Know who you are. So it was presented to me once early on by a guy who was trying to help me along and say, look, you're young. You should try every job, try and do all these different things. You should definitely expand your horizons, make sure you're trying different things. But ultimately, what you want to do is know who you are and try to accentuate or play on or do the things you like doing, do the things that you're good at, there's usually a commonality between the two. If you're not good at time management, great, take a project management course, but don't think that means there's a gap in your world that you've got to become expert in, right? Become expert at the things that suit who you are and your personality. So that was the one guy. And then another guy, said more or less the same, but he was sort of saying, look, I know I'm a good number two. He was basically saying, in an organization, I never aspired to be the CEO. I aspired to be the guy second in command because I know I'm good at doing those things. I'm good at operationally making things happen. I didn't want to be the front man. I didn't want to be the Mick Jagger Rolling Stone kind of situation. I wanted to be the Charlie Watts or the Keith Richards or whatever in the background. So the piece of advice is sort of know yourself and play to your own strengths. That's really what I think that I was told. And that doesn't mean don't try new things. It means when you go into a new situation, turn it to your advantage, to make yourself happy. Do it in a way that only you would do it and other people wouldn't, because ultimately you'll find a bit of pleasure and the chances are that other people will benefit from you being your truly authentic self. So your authentic self in terms of not like just turning up, but authentic as in I know what I'm strong at and I'm going to give you today what I can that I feel I'm good at.
Super insightful. Yeah. Trust in yourself, but take the time to figure out and trust yourself and go full on in that direction. Love it.
Thank you so much, Sigi. We cover quite a lot of your journey, and we will be really looking forward for you to come back and deep dive in some of the topics as we went through. But yeah, really appreciate it, you taking the time to come to the show.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening to this episode. This podcast represents our views and not the ones of our employers.
Our mission at the Data Coffee Break podcast is to inform you and help you grow in this always changing data field.
Follow us and get into the conversation with the community on our LinkedIn page and Instagram.
See you next Tuesday, and until then, keep your data caffeinated.